Hey everyone, and welcome back. You know how we asked for some deep dive topics? Well, this one goes out to all of you who want to dig into the whole younger generations and classical music thing.
That's a question we get a lot, right? Like, is it just a generational thing or is there something more to it?
Right, and we've gone deep, let me tell you. Articles, blog posts, even some of those passionate forum discussions.
Right.
People have thoughts, but our mission today isn't to just list reasons. It's to really figure out why this trend might be happening.
Absolutely. What I find fascinating is what this tells us about how our relationship with music is changing how technology plays into it. Even how we process information these days. It's complex.
Okay, so let's get into it. One thing that kept popping up, and we saw this across a bunch of the sources, is this idea that younger generations just find classical music, well, kind of boring.
Yeah, it's definitely a common perception. But, one of the articles pointed out how classical music wasn't always this niche thing. It used to be a much bigger part of everyday life.
That's true. Like, even you were saying your mom used to play Mozart lullabies.
Every single night. It was actually a really calming part of my routine. It's a perfect example of how early exposure can shape your taste in music. Thinking more broadly, remember when families used to gather around the piano and sing together, or how concerts were like social events?
Yeah, it was a totally different vibe. But then technology started changing things. Record players, the radio, streaming services.
It's a complete shift, and not just in how we listen, but also in what even gets made and put out there. So it makes you wonder, is it that classical music itself is like inherently boring now? Or has our definition of entertaining just changed along with all this technology?
That's a good question. And speaking of how classical music is seen, one source mentioned how people associate it with being highbrow or elitist.
Yeah, and that's interesting because that's a pretty recent thing, historically speaking. To get that, we got to look back at how classical music developed. For example, during the Baroque period, composers like Bach and Handel, they thought music served a higher purpose, like it was a way to connect with something divine. Not so much about personal feelings like we see today.
So less about pouring your heart out after a tough breakup and more about tapping into something bigger.
Exactly. But then, if you jump ahead to the Romantic era, with composers like Chopin or Liszt, you start to see that shift toward music being this way to express deep personal feelings, which is actually way more like the pop music we have today.
Huh. It's like we've circled back around in a way. But it seems like with classical music, especially the older stuff, it asks more of you as a listener,
You're right, a lot of the sources talk about that. You got to meet it on its own terms. It's like it invites you to sit with how complex it is, all the layers of meaning, which, let's be real, can feel kind of different from how we usually take in music now.
Especially with everything being so instant. Right. And our attention spans being, well, remember that stat we talk about how Gen Z has shorter attention spans than goldfish?
Yeah, Okay, maybe a little dramatic. But there's no denying that being constantly bombarded with info, notifications, all those flashing images, it's got to be changing how our brains work.
Totally. Think about social media, those never-ending feeds. It's like we're hardwired for quick hits now. So then someone throws a 30-minute symphony at you. That's got to feel like an eternity compared to a 3-minute pop song or a TikTok.
You're so right. And it's not just classical either. One article even talked about how pop songs are getting shorter too. The average song length on the Billboard charts, way shorter than it used to be.
Wow, so even pop music is shrinking itself down. Wild.
It's a trend, for sure.
Yeah.
But we got to remember the music industry plays a role here too,
Yeah.
right? How music is made and who it's made for.
Totally. The whole business side of things. Did our sources have much to say about that?
Yeah, a bunch of them talked about how mass media changed the game. To reach the biggest audience, you got to make music that's instantly catchy, relatable. Sometimes that means genres like classical, which can be more challenging, get left behind a bit.
Makes sense. It's tough to compete for attention when everyone's going for the simplest, catchiest sound. So is that it for classical then? Is it doomed?
Not necessarily. It's easy to feel pessimistic, but some sources had more hopeful takes. A lot of them were big on the whole early exposure thing, music education.
Oh, right. Like if you grow up with classical music, you're more likely to be into it later on.
Exactly. Schools that have strong music programs, they see more engagement with classical music across all age groups.
So what about those of us who, maybe didn't grow up with a ton of classical music? Are we just out of luck?
Not at all.
Yeah.
Actually, a bunch of the articles talked about how awesome online platforms are, YouTube, streaming services, all that. It's made classical music way more accessible.
True. I found some really cool pieces through movie soundtracks, even video games.
Right. It's like this whole other world opens up.
Totally.
And it actually brings up a bigger point that came up a few times. It's not just about like preserving the old stuff. It's got to evolve, find ways to connect with new generations, you know?
Yeah, so we need like modern composers who can blend the old and the new.
Yeah. Imagine classical music with elements of electronic stuff, jazz, even hip hop.
Yeah.
You honor the tradition, but create something fresh and exciting.
Now that you mention it, I have heard some contemporary classical stuff that mixes genres. It's different for sure, but it still has that like emotional depth I think people are drawn to.
Exactly. It's about those connections, those things that speak to people across generations, across styles even. And sometimes, honestly, it's about being willing to just experience music differently. Maybe it takes a little more patience, you know?
That's a good point. It shouldn't be about forcing ourselves to like something, but being open to it, right?
Yeah, totally. If you're curious, just start exploring. Revisit something you remember from when you were a kid, maybe. Or check out a playlist of contemporary classical. You might be surprised.
This has been really eye-opening. We went way past that whole classical music is boring thing. Learned some fascinating stuff about like how culture changes, how technology plays in, even how our brains work.
It's true. How we connect with music, with any art, really, it's always changing. The important thing is to stay curious, keep exploring.
Well said. And on that note, we'll wrap up this deep dive. We hope this gave you some new ways to think about classical music, maybe even inspired you to give it another listen.